Naomi balanced her laptop on the tiny round cafe table, one hand typing furiously while the other reached for her coffee, now lukewarm and far from the boost she needed. Across from her, Isla swung her legs back and forth, humming absent-mindedly as she arranged sugar packets into patterns on the tabletop. A steady murmur of voices drifted through the air, mingling with the scent of freshly brewed espresso and the faint musk of old books from the attached bookstore. Naomi was on a deadline, and Isla was on the verge of restlessness. Not an ideal combination. She glanced up just as a shadow fell across her table. A man, tall, dark-haired, and dressed like he had just stepped out of a magazine ad for absurdly expensive suits, stood there, one brow arched, mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "You're in my seat," he said. Naomi blinked at him. "Excuse me?" He gestured to the chair opposite her, the one Isla's backpack currently occupied. "This table. I sit here every morning. Your things are in my seat." Naomi exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to rub her temples. "It's a public cafe. I didn't see a name on it." His lips twitched, not quite a smile, not quite irritation. "I don't need a nameplate. The staff knows." Isla looked up, sensing the tension, and Naomi softened, unwilling to let her daughter absorb even a fraction of this stranger's entitled energy. "Well, the staff isn't here to assign seating arrangements," she said. "My daughter and I are working. We'll be here for a while." Instead of moving along, he studied her. Not in the way most people did, with either mild interest or polite dismissal, but like she was something half-remembered, just out of reach. His gaze lingered too long, like he was waiting for something to click into place. "You don't remember, do you?" he murmured. Naomi's pulse jumped. "What?" His expression flickered, something like disappointment. "Nothing," he said, stepping back. "Enjoy your table." That should have been the end of it. But as Naomi tried to refocus on her work, she could feel it, the weight of his gaze from a nearby table, like an itch she couldn't scratch. The words he'd said, the way he'd said them, lodged in her mind. "You don't remember." Like there was something to remember. She had never seen him before in her life. Had she? The alarm buzzed at exactly 6:30 a.m., vibrating against Naomi's nightstand with the urgency of a child tugging at her sleeve. She groaned, rolling over to silence it, then blinked blearily at the ceiling. The apartment was still quiet, the city beyond her window stretching itself awake with the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of an impatient dog. She exhaled, rubbing her eyes before forcing herself upright. The morning routine was predictable: get up, get Isla ready for school, try to squeeze in 10 minutes of peace before the day swallowed her whole. But as she reached for her phone to check her emails, something made her pause. The lock screen was different. She was used to seeing a picture of Isla at the park, mid-laugh, her curls bouncing wildly around her face. But that wasn't what was there. Instead, it was the same image, but someone else was in it. A man. Naomi's fingers tightened around the phone as her heart gave a sharp, disorienting lurch. The man was standing beside Isla, crouched slightly to her height, smiling like he belonged there. She recognized the sharp jawline, the piercing gaze. Lucian. The coffee shop man. Her pulse quickened. It had to be some kind of bizarre glitch. Maybe her phone had synced with an image from the internet, some random AI-generated nonsense. She unlocked it quickly, swiping through her photos, but the feeling of vertigo only grew stronger. He wasn't just in that one picture. He was in every picture. Birthday parties, holidays, Isla's first day of kindergarten. There he was, seamlessly woven into her memories, his arm around her waist, his hand resting protectively on Isla's shoulder. It wasn't just digital either. She stumbled out of bed and crossed the room, pulling open the bottom drawer of her dresser where she kept old photo albums. She flipped through them in frantic disbelief. Lucian at her college graduation, standing next to her parents. Lucian on a road trip she remembered taking alone. Lucian in a hospital waiting room the day Isla was born, looking at her with a quiet, exhausted pride. Naomi pressed a hand to her mouth. The room tilted slightly, the floor beneath her no longer solid. She turned in slow motion toward the bookshelf, where a framed photo of Isla as a toddler sat nestled between stacks of paperbacks. She had always loved that picture, Isla in a sundress, her hands covered in sidewalk chalk, beaming at the camera. Lucian stood next to her in that, too. She stumbled backward, hitting the edge of her bed. The air in the room felt wrong, thick and pressing, as if something unseen had wrapped itself around her life and reshaped it overnight. Her chest heaved as she forced herself to think logically. This was impossible. People didn't just appear in places they had never been. The rational part of her brain whispered explanations, some kind of elaborate prank, a deepfake scam, maybe even some horrifying glitch in reality itself. She had to be imagining things. Her breath came fast and shallow as she pressed her hands to her temples. She needed a second opinion. Someone else's perspective. Someone who would confirm that she wasn't going completely insane. She scrambled to her feet and rushed down the hall to Isla's room, throwing the door open without warning. Isla was at her small desk, bent over a sheet of paper, crayons spread out around her like a painter's palette. She looked up, sleepy-eyed but happy, her face still soft with the warmth of bed. "Mommy, look!" Isla chirped, holding up her drawing. Naomi stared. Lucian. He was right there in the center of the picture, drawn in childish strokes, standing between Isla and Naomi. Isla had colored in his suit, using a gray crayon for the jacket, a darker one for his neatly drawn hair. Across the top, in big, uneven letters, she had scrawled the words, "My family." Naomi's stomach clenched. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Isla giggled like it was the silliest question in the world. "Daddy." Naomi's breath stopped. Her ears rang with the weight of the word. She had raised Isla alone. There had never been a father in the picture, never been anyone who fit that role, let alone a stranger she had argued with in a cafe less than 24 hours ago. The world suddenly felt too small, the walls of their apartment pressing inward, reality itself folding in ways she didn't understand. She took a slow, careful step forward, crouching beside Isla. "Sweetheart, when did you start drawing him?" Isla tapped the crayon against the paper, thinking. "Always." The answer made something twist deep inside Naomi, something primal and cold. "But you never used to." Isla frowned, tilting her head. "Mommy, are you okay?" No. No, she wasn't okay. But she couldn't say that. She forced a smile, her face aching from the effort. I just love your drawing. It's beautiful." Isla beamed and went back to coloring, humming under her breath. Naomi stood up too quickly, gripping the edge of the desk to steady herself. Her mind raced, flipping through every possible explanation. Sleep deprivation? A mental break? Something so simple, so logical, that she just wasn't seeing it? But she had felt Lucian's presence even before this. Something about the way he had looked at her in the cafe, the way he had spoken like they had a history, like he expected her to recognize him. "You don't remember, do you?" The words scraped against the inside of her skull like nails on glass. She turned away from Isla's drawing, gripping the doorframe, steadying herself. She had to figure out what was happening. And she had to do it before this new reality swallowed her whole. Naomi barely remembered the drive to Celeste's apartment. Her hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, knuckles white, thoughts darting like wild animals in every direction. The city blurred past, its familiar streets suddenly foreign, as if she had stepped into a version of her life that wasn't her own. She slammed her palm against the buzzer, tapping her foot in restless agitation as she waited. The door clicked open, and Naomi hurried up the stairs two at a time. Celeste answered in a robe, her hair in a lopsided bun, blinking like she had just woken up. She yawned, stepping aside. Why are you knocking like the FBI? Naomi stormed in, her pulse hammering. Tell me everything you know about Lucian. Celeste sighed, rubbing her temple. I know it's early, but if you're about to confess something scandalous, can it at least come with coffee? Celeste. Something in Naomi's voice must have landed differently, because Celeste straightened, watching her carefully. What's going on? Naomi hesitated, but only for a second. I woke up this morning, and Lucian was in every photo I own. Albums, phone, framed pictures in my house. He's everywhere. But I swear to you, I've never seen him before yesterday. Celeste let out a short laugh, then paused when Naomi didn't join in. Wait. Are you serious? Would I be here if I wasn't? Celeste folded her arms. Naomi, what are you talking about? You and Lucian have been together forever. I introduced you too. Naomi's breath caught. No. You didn't. Yes, I did. 5 years ago at that art exhibit. You were fresh out of that disaster relationship with Daniel, and I said, Naomi, meet Lucian. He's a lawyer, but don't hold that against him. Naomi's stomach twisted so sharply she thought she might be sick. She shook her head. Celeste, that never happened. Celeste gave her a careful look, the kind reserved for toddlers throwing tantrums or people in hospital gowns talking to invisible friends. Are you okay? You're pale. Did you eat today? Stop that. Naomi snapped, pacing the small living room. Don't treat me like I'm crazy. I'm telling you, yesterday he was a stranger, and today he's in every memory of my life. Celeste hesitated, something flickering across her face, concern, confusion, maybe even fear. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. You should talk to him about this, she said gently. Maybe you're just stressed. Naomi's jaw clenched. I need to go. Celeste frowned. Naomi, wait. But she was already out the door. The newsroom buzzed with its usual chaos, the rapid-fire clicking of keyboards, the hum of voices exchanging gossip and deadlines. Naomi walked in, her pulse still erratic from her conversation with Celeste, half convinced she would step inside and find that everything here was normal, that she had simply suffered some bizarre stress-induced episode. That hope lasted less than 3 minutes. Hey, Naomi, her editor, Greg, called as she set her bag down at her desk. Are you bringing Lucian to the office party Friday? The pen in her hand slipped, clattering against the desk. Greg barely looked up from his screen. I told you last year you should have brought him. You always keep that man under wraps. Naomi's fingers dug into the edge of her chair. Why would I bring him? Greg finally glanced up, smirking. Because he's your husband? The words sent a shudder through her. She laughed, too loud, too forced. You're messing with me. Greg's smirk faded. What's going on with you today? She wanted to shake him. She wanted to scream. She had no husband. She had raised Isla alone. Every sleepless night, every scraped knee, every school project, she had done it alone. She had never had Lucian beside her, never whispered to him about bills in the quiet of the night, never fallen asleep with his arm around her waist. And yet Greg looked at her with genuine confusion, like she was the one rewriting history. She grabbed her bag, knocking her chair back in the process. Greg sighed. You okay? Naomi forced a smile that felt like it was stitched onto her face. Just tired. The drive to her mother's house felt both too long and too short. Naomi barely remembered pulling into the driveway, stepping onto the porch, ringing the doorbell. The sound of locks turning made her breath hitch. Her mother answered, wearing an oversized cardigan, her reading glasses perched on top of her head. Naomi. What are you doing here? Naomi swallowed. I need to see some old photos. Her mother frowned. What's wrong? Please, Mom. Just let me see them. Her mother hesitated, then nodded. Come in. Naomi followed her inside, past the floral-scented living room, the shelves stacked with books and framed pictures, the familiar comfort of a home that suddenly felt completely alien. She watched as her mother knelt by the coffee table, pulling out an old photo album. Naomi's breath held as the pages flipped. Lucian was in every single one. Her parents' anniversary dinner. Isla's second birthday. A beach trip Naomi distinctly remembered taking alone. And there he was, smiling, laughing, existing in a past that wasn't his to claim. Her mother sighed wistfully. You were both so young when you met. Naomi's hands clenched into fists. Mom. Please. Tell me you remember things differently. Her mother gave her a confused look. Honey, what's gotten into you? You and Lucian have been together forever. He's been such a good husband, such a good father. A shiver rolled down Naomi's spine. That's not true. Her mother set the album down, worry knitting her brows. Naomi, are you feeling okay? Maybe you need to rest. Stress does strange things to memory. Naomi felt something sharp lodge in her throat. This wasn't stress. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was something else. She stood abruptly. I have to go. Her mother reached for her arm. Naomi, slow down. Whatever's happening, we'll figure it out. Call Lucian. Talk to him. I can't. She pulled away, moving toward the door. Her mother called after her, but the words barely registered. Naomi stepped outside, the sun too bright, the world too wrong. She had to find proof. Proof that she wasn't losing her mind. Proof that somewhere, beneath this false reality, her real life still existed. Dust swirled in the dim attic light as Naomi pushed aside an old trunk, her breath uneven. The air smelled of forgotten things, aged paper, mothballs, the faintest trace of perfume from a life she knew she had lived. Somewhere in this space, buried beneath years of family heirlooms and boxes of childhood memories, was the proof she needed. Proof that the past she remembered was real. She ran her fingers over a stack of photo albums, each one a carefully preserved time capsule. There were albums from her high school years, from Isla's infancy, from vacations she distinctly recalled taking alone. Her hands shook as she opened the nearest one. Lucian was there. She flipped the page. And the next. And the next. Lucian standing beside her at a holiday party, his hand resting lightly on her back. Lucian holding Isla in the hospital, gazing at her with exhausted joy. Lucian on a road trip through California, his sunglasses perched on his nose as if this had always been his life. She dropped the album onto the floor, her fingers twitching, her body fighting against the impossible reality in front of her. A wave of nausea rose in her throat as she reached for another box, ripping it open. Inside, nestled between old greeting cards and delicate lace-trimmed napkins, was a thick leather-bound book. She lifted it carefully, peeling back the cover. It was a wedding album. Her wedding album. Lucian's face looked back at her from the first page, his expression one of effortless happiness. Her own face was there, too, smiling, eyes bright with what should have been a memory, but it wasn't her memory. She turned page after page, her heart slamming against her ribs. The ceremony. The reception. A dance under string lights. Her mother, teary-eyed, Lucian's hand in hers. Isla, impossibly small, dressed in white as if this moment had shaped her, too. A violent shudder rolled through Naomi as she stepped back, the album slipping from her fingers. Her mother's voice drifted up the attic stairs. Did you find what you were looking for? Naomi's stomach clenched. She scrambled to close the album, stuffing it back into the box before she turned toward the entrance. She took the stairs too fast, nearly stumbling into the hallway. Her mother stood there, arms crossed, a warm smile on her face. "You really should have taken better care of that album," she chided playfully. "I told you to store it properly. But you never listen." Naomi licked her lips, swallowing back the scream clawing at her throat. "Mom," she said, voice tight, "tell me the truth. When did I marry Lucian?" Her mother let out a soft laugh, as if the question were absurd. "Sweetheart, you and Lucian have been together for years. You got married 6 months after Isla was born. A small ceremony, but beautiful. Don't you remember?" The words hit Naomi like a slap. Her mother's voice carried on, unaware of the ice spreading through Naomi's veins. "You were both so happy. You cried during your vows, and Lucian, well, he tried to act composed, but we all saw the way he looked at you." Naomi gripped the banister. "No," she whispered. "That never happened." Her mother frowned. "Naomi, what's wrong with you?" "I was there. I held Isla while you danced." Naomi shook her head violently. "Mom, I've never been married. I've never." Her mother sighed, exasperated, before turning toward the hall table. "Maybe you just need a reminder," she murmured, rummaging through a drawer. Naomi's pulse throbbed in her ears. She knew what was coming, what impossible thing was about to be handed to her. Her mother pulled out a crisp, official-looking document and placed it gently in Naomi's hands. A marriage certificate. Naomi's fingers dug into the paper, her entire body cold despite the summer heat pressing through the windows. Her name. Lucian's name. Their wedding date. Their signatures. Her mother watched her, concern finally flickering behind her patient expression. "Maybe you should sit down," she suggested. Naomi couldn't sit. She could barely breathe. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she shoved the paper back at her mother and turned toward the door. "Naomi, wait." But she was already outside, the sunlight too bright, her mind spiraling. She had never married Lucian. And yet, somehow, the entire world believed she had. The receptionist at the neurologist's office tapped her nails against the keyboard, barely looking up as Naomi sat stiffly in the waiting area. The sterile scent of antiseptic and coffee lingered in the air, clashing in an unpleasant way. Naomi's foot tapped against the tiled floor, her body rigid with impatience. Every minute that passed felt like another step deeper into whatever this was, this surreal distortion of her own life. When she had called that morning, her voice shaking, the receptionist had squeezed her into an emergency slot with Dr. Henry Lowell, the city's top neurologist. The phrase, urgent cognitive assessment, had been tossed around, which only made Naomi's chest tighten more. What if this was a medical condition? What if something inside her head had rewired itself overnight, distorting her own memories? Her name was finally called, and she followed a nurse into a pristine office, where Dr. Lowell sat reviewing files. He was in his 60s, silver-haired with half-moon glasses perched on the tip of his nose, the type of man who had seen thousands of patients and wasn't easily rattled. "Ms. Sinclair," he greeted, motioning for her to sit. "Tell me what's going on." Naomi's throat was dry. She tried to say it casually, as if this were any normal concern and not a complete unraveling of reality. "I think I might have memory loss. Or, something worse." Dr. Lowell leaned forward. "What makes you say that?" She hesitated, then let it out in a rush. "I woke up yesterday, and my life was different. Pictures, documents, everything has changed. There's a man in my life now who wasn't there before. But somehow, everyone else remembers him. My family. My friends. Even my daughter." Dr. Lowell didn't react. His pen hovered over his notepad, waiting. She took a deep breath. "I don't remember him. Not in the way I should. But the world does." He nodded, scribbling something down. Have you had any head injuries recently? Any falls? Concussions? No. Seizures? No. Substance use? Alcohol, prescription medication, anything that could alter cognitive function? No, she repeated, frustration creeping in. Dr. Lowell's expression remained calm. Do you have a history of dissociation? Episodes of forgetting things, feeling disconnected? Naomi clenched her fists in her lap. No. This isn't normal forgetting. This is like my entire past has been rewritten overnight. Dr. Lowell flipped to a blank page in his notes. Let's run some basic cognitive tests. He asked her to recall lists of words, to repeat numbers backward, to identify famous figures in photographs. He checked her reflexes, her pupils, her coordination. Every test felt simple. Too simple for something this terrifying. When they were done, he sat back in his chair and let out a thoughtful hum. Your cognitive function is intact. Your neurological responses are normal. Naomi swallowed. So, what does that mean? It means there's no obvious medical reason for what you're experiencing. Her stomach clenched. Then what is happening to me? Dr. Lowell adjusted his glasses. I'd like to refer you to a therapist. Naomi's hands tightened on the armrests. I'm not crazy. I'm not saying you are, he said gently. But what you're describing, this shift in perception, the feeling that reality has changed, these things can sometimes be linked to deep psychological stress. Memory distortion is more common than people think. Naomi stared at him. He was supposed to tell her this was a rare neurological disorder. A glitch in her brain. Something that could be treated with medication or therapy. But no. He was telling her she was fine. Which meant the world had changed, and she hadn't. She left the office feeling no better than when she arrived. The apartment was still, aside from the occasional creak of the building settling. Isla was asleep in her room, her breathing soft and rhythmic through the baby monitor Naomi still hadn't gotten rid of. She sat on the edge of her bed, the weight of the day pressing into her spine. If no one believed her, she needed proof. She reached for her phone, opening the recording app. She steadied her breath, pressed record, and began to speak. My name is Naomi Sinclair. I have never been married. I have never had a husband. I raised Isla alone from the moment she was born. I met Lucian 2 days ago. Before that, I had never seen him in my life. She exhaled. That was the truth. Her truth. She left the phone on the nightstand, crawled under the blankets, and stared at the ceiling. Maybe if she had proof, it would feel real again. The apartment was dark when she woke up, the glow of the phone screen illuminating the nightstand. She must have fallen asleep mid-recording. She sat up, grabbing the phone with a shaking hand, pressing play. Her own voice crackled through the speaker. My name is Naomi Sinclair. I met Lucian at an art exhibit years ago. We fell in love quickly, and we got married 6 months after Isla was born. He's been a wonderful husband, a devoted father. I can't imagine my life without him. Her heart stopped. The phone slipped from her grip and hit the floor with a dull thud. She pressed her hands against her mouth, nausea curling in her stomach. That wasn't what she said. Her voice had changed the words. Her memories had been rewritten. Even when she tried to fight it, the lie was replacing the truth. Naomi sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone, Lucian's name glowing on the screen. Her fingers hovered over the call button. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sigh of wind against the windows. Isla was still asleep, curled up under her favorite pink blanket, completely unaware that her mother's life had become a puzzle with missing pieces. She needed answers. Lucian answered on the 3rd ring. Naomi, he said, his voice warm, familiar. It made her skin prickle. Is everything okay? She swallowed, gripping the edge of the table. I need to see you. Now. A pause. Of course. I'll come over. No, she said quickly. Not here. Somewhere neutral. Neutral? He sounded amused. Naomi, are we negotiating a hostage situation? Her grip on the phone tightened. Just meet me at Café Lark in 20 minutes. When she arrived, Lucian was already there, seated at a table near the window, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked at her like he always had, like she was someone he knew. She took the seat across from him, ignoring the way her hands trembled as she reached for the menu, not to read it, but to keep herself anchored to something real. Lucian studied her, his expression unreadable. You seem tense. She folded the menu shut. I have a few questions for you. He tilted his head. Go ahead. She forced herself to keep her voice even. When did we meet? His lips curled slightly, as if he were expecting something harder. At the art exhibit Celeste dragged you to. You barely looked at me all night, and when you did, you told me you weren't interested in lawyers. Her stomach clenched. How did you propose? She pressed. In your apartment. Isla was asleep in the other room. I made dinner, horribly, I might add. You were wearing that oversized sweater you always steal from me. He leaned forward, voice lower. You cried. Her throat was tight. Where was our honeymoon? Paris. You insisted we skip the touristy stuff, but we still ended up at the Eiffel Tower at midnight, drunk on champagne. You made me promise we'd come back for our 10th anniversary. Her skin felt too tight, like she didn't fit inside her own body anymore. What was my first pet's name? He didn't hesitate. Oliver. A black and white cat. You cried when he died, and you still keep his collar in a drawer. Her breath hitched. She didn't know what answer she had been expecting. A mistake. A hesitation. Something to prove that he wasn't real, that this wasn't real. But he knew everything. Even things she had never told anyone. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Who was my first heartbreak? Something flickered in his expression. Daniel Connors, he said softly. You loved him. And he broke you. The cafe felt too small, the walls pressing in. Naomi pushed back her chair and stood. Lucian stood too, reaching for her hand. Naomi. She pulled away. I have to go. She left him there, his brow furrowed in concern, his coffee still untouched. Naomi barely remembered the drive to Theo's apartment. He had moved to another city 3 years ago, but she still knew his address by heart. Theo had been her closest friend in college, the person she had called at midnight when she was heartbroken, the person who knew everything about her life. She knocked 3 times, her hands clammy, her pulse too fast. When the door swung open, Theo grinned. Well, if it isn't my favorite chaos magnet. The words felt like a hug, like something real in a world that had started unraveling. She let out a shaky breath. Can I come in? He stepped aside. Of course. His apartment smelled like coffee and old books, just like it always had. She followed him to the kitchen, where he poured her a cup before sitting across from her. Talk to me, he said. She met his eyes. Do you know who Lucian is? Theo gave her a puzzled look. Of course. A cold, sinking feeling settled in her gut. Tell me about him. He smirked. What, you want me to rate your husband? Solid 10 out of 10. Even though I still think you could have married someone less put together. But he adores you, so I tolerate him. Her grip on the mug tightened. You've met him? Theo gave her an odd look. Obviously. You introduced us at that awful rooftop party where you spilled wine on his shirt and pretended it was my fault? Her heart pounded in her ears. Naomi, what's going on? She couldn't speak. Everywhere she turned, Lucian was there. In memories that weren't hers. In moments she had never lived. And no one else thought anything was wrong. The cab ride to the airport was a blur of neon lights and muffled city sounds. Naomi sat rigid in the back seat, her fingers gripping the strap of her bag as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. She hadn't packed much, just essentials, whatever she could throw into a carry-on in the 15 minutes before she bolted out of her apartment. Isla was safe with her mother, and Naomi hadn't allowed herself to think too much about that, because thinking about Isla meant questioning whether she was making a mistake. If she stopped now, she'd never leave. She had no plan beyond getting out. Nowhere specific in mind, just somewhere far enough that she could breathe, that she could figure out if she was losing her grip on reality or if reality had lost its grip on her. She bought a last-minute ticket to Lisbon at the self-service kiosk, the kind of destination picked at random, as if throwing a dart at a map. A new place, a new start, a place where Lucian's name wouldn't follow her like a ghost. The line at security was mercifully short. Naomi shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the strap of her bag digging into her shoulder. She kept her breathing steady, kept her mind focused on the next step, boarding, sitting down, lifting off, distance. Her turn came. She slid her passport across the counter, offering the security officer a polite, nonchalant smile, as if she weren't desperately running from something she couldn't explain. The woman behind the counter barely looked at her before flipping the passport open. And then she frowned. Naomi's stomach twisted. The woman scanned the document again, her brow furrowing. She looked up, eyes flicking over Naomi's face with a sharpness that made her palms sweat. "One moment, please." She turned to a colleague, murmuring something too low for Naomi to hear. The colleague, another officer, older, with an air of quiet authority, took the passport, glanced at it, then at Naomi. "Ma'am, can you confirm your full name for me?" Her pulse spiked. "Naomi Sinclair." The officer exchanged a look with his coworker. "That's not what it says here," he said. A cold weight settled in her chest. "What?" The officer turned the passport toward her, tapping a manicured finger against the name printed in black ink. "Naomi Ellington." Her breath stalled. "No." Her fingers trembled as she took the passport, staring at the page, as if she could will the letters to change, as if they weren't proof that the world was rewriting itself faster than she could run from it. Lucian's last name. She had never changed it. Had never even considered it. And yet, there it was, official and unwavering, stamped and validated like a fact she had no say in. "This must be a mistake," she heard herself say, but the words were hollow. The officer studied her carefully. "Do you have any other identification?" She fumbled for her driver's license, yanking it out of her wallet so quickly it nearly slipped from her fingers. She shoved it toward him, her breath uneven. He examined it, lips pressing into a thin line. "It matches your passport." Naomi's hands clenched. "No. That's not possible." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, are you feeling all right?" No. Nothing was all right. She forced a tight smile, fighting the nausea clawing up her throat. She exhaled sharply, trying to steady herself, trying to make sense of something that refused to be understood. "I must have booked the ticket under the wrong name." She didn't. She knew she didn't. "Do you have a credit card with the name on the ticket?" the officer asked. Her mouth felt dry. It should match." "I used my real name." He handed her passport back, giving her a long, measured look. "Check with the airline desk. They may be able to correct it, but we can't let you through unless the names match." Her limbs felt unsteady as she stepped away, moving toward the airline counter in a daze. The woman at the desk offered a bright, professional smile. "How can I help you?" Naomi slid her ticket across the counter, trying to keep her hands from shaking. I need to change the name on this. There was a mix-up. The woman typed something into her computer, eyes scanning the screen. Okay, let's take a look. She frowned. I don't see a reservation under this name. Naomi's heart slammed against her ribs. That's not possible. I booked it an hour ago. The woman shook her head. Are you sure you used this name? Sometimes, if your passport has a different name, the system updates it automatically. Naomi swallowed. Can you check? More typing. More silence. The woman's brows knitted together. There is a ticket under Naomi Ellington, she said slowly. Naomi's vision blurred. That's not my name. The woman gave her a sympathetic look. It's the only ticket under your information. If you have a different name, you'd have to book a new one. Naomi barely heard her. Lucian's name was everywhere. In her photos. In her documents. In her past. And now, it was stamped onto her identity, stitched into the fabric of her existence, no matter how much she tried to tear it away. She turned and walked away from the counter, the noise of the airport fading into the background, drowned by the ringing in her ears. She wasn't just trapped in this rewritten world. She was becoming it. Naomi sat in the airport lounge, her head in her hands, the two bright overhead lights pressing against her skull like a migraine. Around her, life carried on as usual, travelers scrolling through their phones, sipping overpriced coffee, flipping through magazines they wouldn't buy. Everything was normal. Everything except her. She had tried to leave. Had bought a ticket, walked through security, handed over her passport, her real passport, with her real name. And yet, the world had other plans. The world had rewritten her name, her history, her entire existence. Lucian's name was hers now. She squeezed her eyes shut. This was a dream. A fever. A psychotic break. It had to be. Maybe if she sat here long enough, if she breathed slow and deep, if she ignored the panic clawing up her throat, she would wake up. Naomi. Her body stiffened. She knew that voice. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat. Lucian stood in front of her, hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression that was softer than it had ever been. There was no amusement, no teasing remark, no attempt to convince her of things she knew weren't real. Just quiet understanding, like he had been waiting for this moment. She exhaled sharply, pushing to her feet. How did you find me? You didn't think I'd let you leave, did you? His voice was calm, steady, as if none of this was unusual, as if she wasn't desperately trying to escape a life she didn't remember choosing. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. I need you to tell me the truth. Lucian's gaze flickered, something unreadable passing through his eyes. He hesitated, then nodded toward the empty chair beside hers. Sit with me. She didn't want to sit. She wanted answers. But her legs were shaking, and she was afraid that if she stayed standing, she might collapse. She lowered herself back into the chair, gripping the edge of the armrest like an anchor. Lucian settled beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, close enough that it felt dangerously familiar. I know this has been hard on you, he said. Her laugh was sharp, humorless. Hard? My entire life has been rewritten. My past. My identity. My own daughter remembers a father who didn't exist until 2 days ago. She turned to face him fully, her voice trembling. And you just went along with it. Lucian's jaw tightened. Because it's what you wanted. Naomi's breath caught. She stared at him, waiting for him to take it back, to say he misspoke, but he didn't. Her hands clenched into fists. I would never have wanted this. Lucian tilted his head slightly, studying her like he was seeing two versions of her at once, the Naomi she was now, and the Naomi she had been. You did, he said quietly. You just don't remember. The airport lounge faded. The people, the noise, the distant rumble of suitcases rolling across the floor, none of it mattered anymore. She forced herself to breathe. Tell me. Lucian leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers threading together. He was quiet for a moment, as if searching for the right place to begin. A long time ago, before all of this, you had your heart broken. Naomi's throat tightened. You loved someone, Lucian continued. And they hurt you. Badly. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something heavy, something close to sorrow. You were devastated. You wanted to erase the pain, to undo it all. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. You made a wish. Her stomach turned. A wish? Lucian's lips curved, but there was no amusement in it. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? But you did. You begged for a love that had always been there. A love without heartbreak, without loss, without fear. You didn't just want to move on, you wanted a life where the pain never existed at all. A shiver ran through her. You got what you asked for, Lucian said. The past rewrote itself. Your memories changed. The world became the life you wished for. She felt like she couldn't breathe. No. This was impossible. This was insane. And yet. Her hands trembled as they pressed against her lap. Why you? Lucian's gaze softened. Because I loved you enough to step into the place you made for me. Something inside her cracked, sharp and painful, like a dam breaking after holding back a flood for too long. You're lying, she whispered. Lucian didn't flinch. I'm not. Naomi shook her head, gripping the armrests until her knuckles ached. She had never wished for this. She would remember if she had. Wouldn't she? Her mind reeled. All this time, she had been looking for proof that the world was wrong, that this wasn't real, that she was the only one who remembered the truth. But what if this was the truth? What if the world hadn't changed? What if she had? Naomi sat in the back of Lucian's car, staring out the window as the city passed in hazy streaks of neon and headlights. Her mind was unraveling, piece by piece, thread by thread, as she tried to comprehend the weight of what he had told her. She had wished for this. She had begged the universe to take away her heartbreak, to give her a love that had never wavered, never failed her. And the universe, or whatever cruel force had granted her wish, had done exactly that. It had erased the pain. It had rewritten her life. But at what cost? Her hands twisted in her lap as Lucian drove, his silence filling the space between them like a ghost. She could feel his eyes on her, waiting, but she didn't speak. She didn't know how. Finally, after what felt like hours, he pulled into the driveway of their house. Not her house. Their house. Naomi hesitated before stepping out of the car. The house was warm, familiar, filled with a life she was supposed to remember but didn't. The porch light flickered against the dark, illuminating the flower pots she had apparently picked out, the welcome mat that now bore Ellington instead of Sinclair. Lucian opened the front door, motioning for her to step inside. She did, her feet moving on autopilot. The air smelled like cinnamon and coffee. There were shoes by the door, Isla's pink sneakers beside a pair of Lucian's polished dress shoes. A framed photo hung on the wall, the three of them on a beach, Lucian lifting Isla onto his shoulders as Naomi laughed beside them, wind whipping her hair across her face. She had never been to that beach. And yet, here was the proof that she had lived this life. Lucian watched her as she took it all in. He didn't push. Didn't rush her. He just let her move through the house at her own pace, let her touch the life she had unknowingly built. In the kitchen, she ran her fingers over the marble countertops, the mugs hanging from hooks, the fridge covered in Isla's drawings, and every single one had Lucian in them. A lump formed in her throat. She turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. If I undo it. Lucian's expression didn't change. I'll be gone. Her fingers curled into her palm. And Isla? His eyes softened. She'll forget me. The words landed in her chest like a punch. She won't remember ever having a father? Lucian shook his head. Not me. Naomi felt her body sway, and she gripped the counter to steady herself. The choice was no longer just about her. She could walk away from this world, reclaim the life she remembered. But Isla would lose the father she had always known. The thought of her daughter waking up one morning to a different reality, missing someone she could no longer name, sent a sharp pain through Naomi's ribs. Lucian took a step toward her. Spend tomorrow with me. She looked up at him, her vision blurred at the edges. Lucian's voice was steady. Give yourself one day to live this life. Then decide. Naomi didn't respond, but she didn't say no, either. Morning came, and it was almost too easy to pretend this life was real. Lucian made breakfast while Isla chattered excitedly at the table, telling them about the book she was reading in class. Naomi watched, the scene playing out like something from a dream, one she didn't remember having but fit into perfectly. Lucian leaned over the counter, handing Naomi a cup of coffee just the way she liked it. Without thinking, she took a sip. Without thinking, she smiled. It felt terrifyingly natural. Later, they took Isla to the park. Naomi watched as Lucian pushed her on the swings, his laughter blending with hers, filling the crisp afternoon air. He caught her when she leaped from the swing, spinning her around before setting her down with exaggerated care. Isla giggled, breathless. Mommy, look. Daddy's so strong. Naomi's chest ached. Lucian glanced at her, his eyes searching, but he didn't say anything. The day stretched on, a picnic, a lazy afternoon spent watching Isla build a blanket fort in the living room, dinner filled with soft conversation and shared glances Naomi didn't know how to interpret. That night, when Isla fell asleep, Naomi stood by her bed, watching her breathe. Her small fingers were curled around a stuffed rabbit, her face peaceful, content. Lucian appeared beside her, his voice low. She loves you more than anything. Naomi swallowed. She loves you, too. Lucian's hand barely brushed hers, his touch light. I know. Naomi didn't move. She didn't know how. Because now, she had to choose. Naomi stood in the doorway of Isla's bedroom, arms crossed over her chest, watching as Lucian pulled the blankets up to Isla's chin. She was already half asleep, her fingers curled around the stuffed rabbit she had insisted on bringing everywhere since she was 3. Lucian smoothed her curls away from her face, his touch gentle, practiced. Do you want the nightlight on? He murmured. Isla let out a tiny, drowsy sigh. Lucian reached for the small lamp on her nightstand, flicking it on. The soft glow filled the room, casting shadows across the walls. Love you, Daddy, Isla mumbled, already slipping deeper into sleep. Naomi felt something pull tight in her chest. Lucian brushed his fingers over her forehead, then leaned in, whispering something Naomi couldn't quite hear. Whatever it was, it made Isla's lips curl into a sleepy smile before she drifted off completely. Lucian stood, turning toward Naomi as he stepped out of the room, carefully closing the door behind him. Naomi swallowed. What did you say to her? Lucian hesitated, then smiled. It's something I always tell her. That she's my best girl. Naomi's throat felt thick. Lucian had been woven into Isla's life in ways she had never imagined, in bedtime rituals, in whispered reassurances, in the tiny, unnoticed moments that made up childhood. Moments Naomi had never questioned before because she had lived them alone. She turned away, walking down the hall, her thoughts restless, her mind tangled. In the living room, she hesitated before picking up a framed photograph from the shelf. It was a picture of her and Lucian on what appeared to be a vacation, her arms wrapped around his neck, his forehead pressed to hers, both of them laughing at something unseen. She didn't remember taking it. But she could feel the love in it. The warmth. The history. She placed the frame back down and moved to the bookshelf, where more photos lined the surface. Their wedding picture. Isla's first day of school. A shot of them cooking together in the kitchen, flour dusting Lucian's sleeve, Naomi mid-laugh. The life she had unknowingly built was beautiful. Lucian entered the room, stopping a few feet away from her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Naomi let out a breath. You remember everything, don't you? Lucian's expression was unreadable. Yes. Everything about me. About Isla. Yes. Her fingers traced the edge of a picture frame. What's my favorite coffee order? Lucian's lips twitched. Depends on the season. In the summer, iced vanilla lattes. In the winter, black coffee, except when you're feeling indulgent, then it's caramel macchiatos with extra foam. She swallowed. My favorite book? The Secret History. He tilted his head. Though you pretend it's something more sophisticated when people ask. Naomi exhaled sharply, shaking her head. What song do I always play when I can't sleep? Lucian smiled. That old jazz track. The one you used to hum when Isla was a baby. Her breath hitched. Every small detail. Every insignificant thing about her, he knew them all. Lucian stepped closer, his voice quieter now. You wished for a love that never left, Naomi. And that's what you got. Her chest ached. She had been alone for so long. She had endured heartbreak, disappointment, long nights of wondering why love had never lasted for her. And now, she had something steady, something unbreakable. But it wasn't real. Or was it? She met Lucian's gaze, something breaking inside her. What if I don't want to lose this? Lucian didn't answer right away. His expression softened, but there was something sad in his eyes, something like knowing. Naomi had spent so long trying to escape this life, but standing here now, she wasn't sure she wanted to. Naomi sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the edges of the drawer she had just pulled open. It was filled with the usual forgotten things, old receipts, half-used notebooks, a tangled pair of earbuds that had long since stopped working. She hadn't been looking for anything in particular, just something to keep her hands busy, something to distract her from the unbearable weight pressing against her ribs. And then she saw it. A folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, buried beneath a stack of old birthday cards. Her breath hitched. She didn't remember putting it there. She picked it up carefully, the paper delicate from time, her own handwriting peeking through the folds. Her stomach twisted as she opened it. It wasn't a list. Not a grocery reminder, not a note to herself about a deadline or an appointment. It was a letter. To herself. Her own words, written in handwriting she barely recognized, messy, uneven, as if her hands had been shaking when she wrote it. I don't want to hurt anymore. Her breath stilled. I don't want to wake up thinking about him. I don't want to go to sleep replaying the way he left. I don't want to feel like something inside me has been hollowed out. I don't want to carry this pain for the rest of my life. Her fingers curled around the paper. If I can't forget, then take it away. Give me a love that never leaves. One that doesn't break. One that has always been there, so I never have to know what it feels like to lose it. The air in the room thickened. Erase the pain. Rewrite it. Give me something real. Naomi's vision blurred. She had done this to herself. She had begged the universe to take away her heartbreak, to erase the version of herself that had been abandoned, that had felt so impossibly unlovable. And it had listened. She pressed the letter against her chest, squeezing her eyes shut. She had been so desperate to be free of her own sadness that she had wished an entirely different life into existence. Lucian had never been a stranger. He had been the answer to a plea she had written with shaking hands, on a night when the pain had been too much to bear. Her knees hit the floor before she even realized she had collapsed. She had been running this whole time, searching for proof, for some kind of explanation, some justification that this reality wasn't hers. But it was. She had made it. She had chosen it. And now, she didn't know if she could undo it. Naomi sat on the floor of her bedroom, the crumpled letter still clenched in her hand. Her breathing was uneven, shallow, like she had forgotten how to do something as simple as pulling air into her lungs. The weight of the words she had written all those years ago pressed against her, heavier than anything she had ever carried. She had made this wish. She had been so desperate to erase the pain that she had rewritten her entire world. But now, she had a choice. Lucian had given her that much. He hadn't begged her to stay. He hadn't tried to manipulate her into choosing this life. He had simply looked at her, steady and patient, waiting for her to decide. She had spent so long trying to prove that this wasn't real. But it was real. The love, the memories, the life she had unknowingly created, it all existed. And yet, so did the life she had left behind. She had a past. A past she had once sworn she didn't want. A past that still belonged to her, even if she had buried it beneath a wish. Her fingers tightened around the paper, and before she could stop herself, before she could talk herself out of it, she whispered, "I want to remember." The room blurred. The walls, the furniture, the photographs, everything around her seemed to bend inward, colors bleeding together like ink in water. The air turned thick, pressing against her ears, muffling the sounds of her own ragged breathing. Then, nothing. A complete, suffocating silence. And then, darkness. Naomi's eyes fluttered open, her head pounding, her limbs heavy. The first thing she noticed was the cold, the absence of warmth, the way the air in the room felt sharper, emptier. She was lying in bed. Not their bed. Her bed. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar, too high, too bare. She turned her head, slowly, cautiously, like she was afraid the movement might shatter whatever fragile reality she had stepped into. The room was different. Smaller. Quieter. She pushed herself upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was in an apartment, not the house she had shared with Lucian, not the life she had built with him. Her fingers dug into the sheets. It had worked. She had undone it. She had chosen to remember. A hollow ache settled in her chest, so deep and sharp it made her breath hitch. She should have felt relief, should have felt some sense of victory. But all she felt was the overwhelming, unbearable absence of him. Naomi sat on the edge of the bed, the sheets unfamiliar beneath her fingertips. The room felt too quiet, the air too still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, her fingers stiff, her body reluctant, like it already knew what she was about to find. The screen lit up. No missed calls. No messages. She opened her contacts, scrolling with careful precision. There was no Lucian. Her stomach twisted. She scrolled again, slower this time, searching for anything, an old message, a call history, a name that might have once belonged to him. But he wasn't there. He had never been there. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to move, to push back the blankets and step onto the floor. The hardwood was cold under her bare feet, the reality of it sinking into her skin. She walked down the hall toward Isla's room, her breath coming too fast, too shallow. The door was ajar, the soft hum of morning light stretching across the floor. Naomi peeked inside, her pulse hammering as she took in the familiar sight, her daughter, curled under the blankets, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. Nothing had changed. Except everything had. Naomi stepped inside, glancing at the desk in the corner of the room, where Isla's drawings were scattered in a colorful mess. She picked one up, her hands trembling. It was a picture of the two of them, just the two of them. No Lucian. No tall figure standing beside her. No suit, no sharp smile, no careful hand resting on Isla's shoulder. Naomi picked up another drawing. Then another. They were all the same. Isla had always drawn their little family with 3 people. Now there were only 2. Naomi's throat tightened. She turned toward the bookshelf, where framed photographs had once held an entire life she had only recently begun to believe in. The wedding photo was gone. The family pictures, the certificates, the memories, all erased. It was like he had never existed. Her vision blurred, the edges of the room tilting slightly, but she didn't let herself cry. She had chosen this. She had asked for this. And now, Lucian was nothing more than a dream she had woken up from. Naomi sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her, the screen casting a pale glow against her skin. The apartment was still, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant honk of a car outside. Isla was in her room, humming to herself as she played, completely unbothered by the absence Naomi couldn't stop noticing. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Lucian Ellington. She typed his name and hit search. The results loaded instantly, but her stomach dropped. Nothing. She tried again, this time adding more details. Lucian Ellington, New York. Lucian Ellington, lawyer. Lucian Ellington, anything at all. Still nothing. She sat back, gripping the edge of the table, nausea curling in her stomach. It wasn't possible. Even if they had never met in this version of her life, even if she had erased him, he should still exist. People didn't just vanish. But he had. She pressed her hands against her temples, her breath uneven. She needed proof. She got up, moving quickly to the hallway closet, yanking open the door. Boxes stacked neatly on top of each other, labeled with old addresses, the remnants of past moves. She pulled down the one marked documents, dragging it to the living room. Her fingers rifled through papers, birth certificates, bank statements, tax records. Her marriage license should have been here. Isla's birth certificate should have had his name. She unfolded them, her pulse pounding. Her name was there. Isla's name was there. But Lucian's? Nothing. A sharp pain shot through her skull, and she winced, pressing her fingertips against her temples. Something was slipping. Her memories, the ones she had fought so hard to hold on to, were fading. She tried to picture his face. His voice. The way he laughed when Isla did something silly. The way he always kept his hand on the small of her back when they walked. The way he looked at her, like she was the only person in the world. But the details were slipping through her fingers, blurring at the edges, dissolving into something hazy, unreachable. Her body swayed slightly, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. She had spent days fighting against this new reality. Now it was fighting back. She took a shaky breath and reached for her laptop again. She searched deeper, combing through legal records, old court filings, anything that could anchor him to the world. But there was nothing. No birth record. No LinkedIn profile. No digital footprint. Lucian Ellington had never been born. Which meant Naomi hadn't just erased him from her life. She had erased him from everything. Naomi sat on the couch, her laptop balanced on her knees, the cursor blinking in the empty search bar. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant, uncertain. She had spent days trying to prove that Lucian had existed, only to find that he hadn't. And now, she was about to do the opposite, look for the man who had once broken her heart. The man she had tried so hard to erase that she had rewritten reality itself. She typed the name slowly. Daniel Connors. Her heart pounded as she pressed enter. The search results loaded instantly. He was still out there. Her eyes scanned the screen, her breath catching as she found his LinkedIn profile, a business website, an alumni page from their old university. His face stared back at her from a corporate headshot, older, sharper, the same but different. He was still in New York. Still working in finance. Still living a life that, at one point, had been tangled up with hers. She clicked on his personal website, scrolling through images of him at charity events, standing beside people she didn't recognize. He looked happy. Completely unaffected by the memory of her. And why wouldn't he be? In this version of reality, they had never met again after their breakup. There were no awkward run-ins at coffee shops, no late-night texts they regretted the next morning. No lingering looks across rooms full of people, no almosts, no what-ifs. They had simply ended. And yet, the pain she had once felt, the grief that had driven her to wish away an entire lifetime, was gone. She had begged the universe to take it from her, and it had. Now, she sat there, staring at his face, feeling nothing at all. Her hands trembled as she closed the laptop. She stood, needing air, needing movement, needing something that wasn't this silence pressing down on her like a weight. Outside, the city was alive, people moving, voices overlapping, the scent of coffee and fresh bread drifting from the bakery across the street. She walked aimlessly, letting the noise fill the hollow space inside her. She slowed as she passed a cafe, drawn by the sound of laughter, a couple sitting by the window, leaning toward each other, the kind of effortless closeness that made everything else fade away. And then, a man turned his head. Her breath caught. Lucian. It was him, or at least, it looked like him. The same dark hair, the same sharp features, the same way he tilted his head as he listened. But then the light shifted, and the face wasn't his. The man laughed at something his companion said, and just like that, he was a stranger again. Naomi exhaled, pressing a hand against her ribs, steadying herself. Love wasn't meant to be erased. It was meant to be carried. Even when it hurt. Even when it left scars. She took a deep breath and kept walking.